No one who puts a hand to the plow and looks back is fit for the kingdom of God. Today, I know many of us are hurting, are angry, and are deeply worried about the future of this nation. I also want to acknowledge that some of us are not, or may not be on the same page, particularly about the theology and ethics of abortion. Let me begin by saying that I will not undertake to treat this in my sermon. If you're interested in learning more about that, I would direct you to Malcolm's recent sermon on the subject and to the official statement by the presiding bishop's office on the rationale for the Episcopal Church's longtime support of reproductive choice in this nation, which the cathedral also supports. I also want to acknowledge this Pride Sunday, on this 7th anniversary of Obergefell, that many in our congregation and wider community woke up this morning with very real and very legitimate anxiety over the future of their marriages. As an openly gay man, engaged to my partner of some 4 years, I share that anxiety in a deep and personal way. Still, I will not address this question directly either. The reason I'm not engaging the specifics of these issues, abortion or same-sex marriage, is because they are only tactical struggles in a much larger culture war. Many in progressive circles proclaimed a premature end to the culture wars following the defeat of Republicans in the 2008 election cycle and the subsequent ascendancy of the Obama era in American public life. It seemed for a time that the bread and butter social issues used to divide our republic along the lines of red and blue grew stale in the mouth of American citizens who soured on the fear-mongering in favor of a sweeter, more hopeful vision of who we could be, a kinder and a more purple nation. But in war, strategy, not tactics, ultimately wins the day. And with each successive win on progressive issues, conservatives saw an opening and exploited it to the full. Their message was simple, persuasive, and relentless. Progressives aren't just aiming for progress on certain social issues, but want to dismantle our republic, take away your way of life, eviscerate its moral fabric, trample religious liberties, discredit our cherished traditions, and capitulate to foreign adversaries. Then we got He Who Shall Not Be Named, and 3 conservative justices later, here we are. The tides have turned. The reason we're here is because conservatives patiently bided their time and kept their eye on the long game. And so must we. We must set our face like flint toward Jerusalem. They've always been good at strategy. Since at least the 1970s, they have understood that the presidency was only just a means to stack the court with their ideological siblings until such a time as this, when the legal scaffolding of social progress could be demolished in totis. But the specific issues of the culture war mask what is a much deeper philosophical and theological rift in this nation and in the church. And until we are able to adequately arm ourselves with the knowledge to understand it and develop a clear sense of our own philosophical and theological commitments, then we'll continue in this war like destroyers to hurl volleys at one another on the ocean's surface while the real war is happening, being fought by submarines well out of sight, hundreds of meters below. We must go deeper. So let's explore not simply the outcome of the verdict rendered, but the logic employed and contested to get there, with a view toward the implications for our faith today. Writing for the majority, Justice Alito argues, quote, "We hold that Roe and Casey must be overruled. The Constitution makes no reference to abortion, and no such right is implicitly protected by any constitutional provision, including the one on which the defenders of Roe and Casey now chiefly rely, the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. That provision has been held to guarantee some rights that are not mentioned in the Constitution. But any such right must be, quote, deeply rooted in this nation's history and tradition, and, quote, in the concept of ordered liberty, end quote. In simple terms, the majority argued that the court conferred a right that it did not have the right to confer because it wasn't explicitly stated in the text of the Constitution. And in fact, prior to the creation of that right, numerous laws against the practice were on the books. Sound familiar? If you're one of the many cultural refugees from conservative Catholic or evangelical backgrounds sitting in our pews or listening online, and you found yourself being triggered by that language, there's a reason for that. Constitutional originalism is only possible because of biblical literalism. They are fraternal twins in the same family of interpretation. Biblical literalism preceded and, in my opinion, laid the foundation for constitutional originalism because they are both premised on the same flawed conceit, that the plain sense of the text, its meaning for the generation who penned or received it, is perfectly accessible to us today, and we are morally obliged to recover and to assert it. Underlying such an approach is the assumption that the best hope we can have for today is to look to and conserve a bygone golden age. The dissenting justices offered a scathing rebuke, outlining an alternative judicial philosophy for how we read and interpret these texts called the living constitution approach. And I quote, "As a matter of constitutional method, the majority's commitment to replicate in 2022 every view about the meaning of liberty held in 1868 has precious little to recommend it. Our law in this constitutional sphere, as in most, has for decades upon decades proceeded differently. It has considered fundamental constitutional principles, the whole course of the nation's history and traditions, and the step-by-step evolution of the court's precedents. It is disciplined, but not static. It relies on accumulated judgments, not just the sentiments of one long-ago generation of men who themselves believed and drafted the Constitution to reflect that the world progresses." Now, despite that final line being in parentheses in the text of the actual verdict, I think it merits further reflection. Constitutional originalism works no better than biblical literalism because the founding documents to which these philosophies point don't actually support these views, literally. They were forged from revolutions. Their whole purpose is to take those revolutionary impulses and routinize them into structures that can facilitate the process of change over time in such a way that we're not plunged into bloodshed and chaos every time we disagree. The idea that unless it's in the Constitution, it's not covered is just as preposterous as unless it's in the Bible, it's not covered. Much of our world today could not have been and was never intended to be predicted. That's why in both the Constitution and the Bible, we get a process, an implied internal logic, a kind of map, not just a verdict. The earliest framers of this nation knew they were engaging in the largest, most daring experiment in self-government ever undertaken in the history of the world. They were men of the Enlightenment era and thoroughly believed in the notion of progress. Even the most conservative among them were definitionally progressive. They'd be appalled at the apparent confidence some on the court have in their ability to interpret the letter of the law according to the manner of its intended meaning hundreds of years ago and simply apply it as is to the questions and challenges we confront today. A nuanced approach to reading and interpreting demands that all proceed with greater humility than certainty. And that was the subtext of Chief Justice Roberts' exceedingly rare rebuke of his own majority. He wrote, and I quote, "Both court opinion and the dissent display a relentless freedom from doubt on the legal issue that I cannot share. Unquote. Wow. In my opinion, we must go further still. If the purpose is to deduce what the text originally meant, then the range of meaning and subsequent applications would be limited by the sociocultural constructs in which that meaning first arose. Because after all, meaning never actually arises in a vacuum. And since we do not belong to those constructs, the notion that we have the tools to deduce a textual meaning free from our own subjective bias, including our political, religious, and social values, is frankly just a little bit delusional. The work of interpretation isn't simply to excavate the original meaning of a text. It is equally to be aware of the bias we cannot help but bring to the text, and going one step further, to acknowledge in real humility that the fruit of interpretation is thus never simply an act of recovery, but more truthfully, an act of constructive meaning-making in which we are real participants. In other words, interpretation is phenomenologically and categorically progressive, even if sometimes the actual result appears to be regressive by some kind of qualifying metric. Interpretation never resides in the past, but is always moving toward a future to answer present pressures and possibilities. Now, this is not to say that anything goes. Arguing that the book of Genesis is a treatise on the flying spaghetti monster is just as preposterous and insulting in the opposite direction as our claims that we know God hates homosexuality because Leviticus 18:22 calls male-on-male intercourse toevah. Abomination is abomination is abomination, conservatives will argue. Well, actually, abomination is not abomination, because what was meant by that word in King James English and what was meant by that word in Iron Age Hebrew are two quite different things, which highlights the fatal flaw in both constitutional originalism and biblical literalism. If you do them well, you are invariably led to the conclusion that some degree of selective bias is necessary for the work of interpretation because we have to make judgment calls about contested meanings all the time. Trying to purge the Constitution or the Scriptures from those dirty liberals with their self-serving and selective interpretations is pointless, hypocritical, and self-defeating. Everyone selects. Everyone invokes bias. It's impossible not to. It's part, theologically, of our creaturely contingency. Consider, for instance, that the day before Roe was overruled because an objective, plain-sense reading of the Constitution offered up no basis for its support, that same conservative majority also repealed a law in New York that requires proper cause to obtain an open carry license. And I'm probably not going where you think I'm going. Why? Because the Second Amendment of the Constitution clearly states, quote, "The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed," unquote. Of course, they conveniently omitted the first part of that amendment, which conditions said owning and carrying on, quote, "a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state," end quote. You don't need a law degree from Yale to understand that the word militia means something quite different in 2022 than it did in 1789. No longer a bulwark against British tyranny when the newly formed nation lacked a professional army for its self-defense, but more like Proud Boys, storming our nation's capital to attempt to overturn a duly held presidential election. Or that given the realities of modern warfare, the idea that the second largest nuclear power on Earth has any hope of being secured by a band of ragtag gun owners is patently absurd. A plain-sense reading of the Second Amendment would strip all gun-owning rights from everyone who is not part of or planning to enroll in the U.S. military and its various federal and state-sanctioned militias or the police. But I'm pretty sure we're never going to see that verdict from this court. Again, these documents don't simply point us to objective facts, but to a framework for a subjective process and the internal logic guiding that process. if the whole purpose of the New Testament were just to say, oh yeah, by the way, you don't need to get circumcised and you can eat as much shellfish as you like, then why bother to have all that other stuff in between? I just said that in 2 sentences. When people read the Bible for a list of thou shalt and thou shalt nots, they miss the point and they dishonor the God who inspired it. God isn't just handing us a record of a verdict. God is showing us the process so that we can employ in the future when God decides to do something new again and we can't agree on what it means for us. As Peter learned the hard way in Acts chapter 11, it's not a matter of if, but when. And it didn't take very long after the resurrection for it to happen. You'll recall that when Peter denies Gentiles access to the community, God lowers a sheet of animals that God's own word in Leviticus forbids to be consumed and commands Peter to get up, kill, and eat. Peter protests, insisting that nothing unclean has ever been put in his mouth. Lord, your word says it right here, read it. Read it. It's your own words, right? On this pride, let's remember that a voice came from heaven proclaiming, quote, what God has made clean, you must not call profane. God is always moving ahead of and beyond the church, utterly sovereign over who is in and who is out, lowering the sheet of unclean things and commanding us to eat. That's kind of God's thing after all. Behold, I am making all things new. The simple fact of the matter is that God is progressive, and so is the Bible. Elisha doesn't ask for the same blessing, but a double portion, and God gives it to him. God is not returning us to a garden, but leading us to a city. Think about that. Our omega point isn't a sprawling natural paradise, but a built environment, fashioned from living stones, you and I, as our opening collect reminded us. And even here, at this table, the fruits of our labor of grape and grain, meeting human ingenuity and industry to become bread and wine, are taken up and employed in the co-construction of a new world. God and us, building something beautiful and unpredictable and new together. It's only for us to step with courage into the future where God already lives. No one puts a hand to the plow and looks back is fit for the kingdom of God.